So when the United States votes $400 million to help that war, we're not voting for a giveaway program. We're voting for the cheapest way that we can prevent the occurrence of something that would be of the most terrible significance to the United States of America, our security.
If we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
If the United States now were to throw in the towel and come home, and the communists took over South Vietnam, then all over Southeast Asia, all over the Pacific, in the Mideast, in Europe, in the world, the United States would suffer a blow. And peace, because we are the great peacekeeping nation in the world today because of our power, would suffer a blow from which it might not recover.
First came a few advisors, then the Marines. Eventually, an army 500,000 strong. That was the Vietnam War. It was a war never officially declared, with no front lines or defined aims. A war fought against a shadowy foe. A war.
Speak to me.
Yeah, I'm still alive.
Speak to me.
Huh? I don't know.
What's your name? Tell me what your name is.
Louis.
Where are you from?
Steve, Seattle, Washington.
Seattle, Washington. It's a good town. Good town, good town.
I
Very
like
good.
to go to sleep, though.
Huh?
I go to sleep.
No, don't go to sleep.
We had some precarious situations and we lost some people, but we always won. So to me, we were very successful, you know, but as I think of it now, I don't know what we won. We won a box on a map where the next day we left it and we never came back, maybe.
It was a war that confused friend and foe alike.
Wherever the Americans went, they burned and destroyed and killed. I didn't see any guerrillas being killed, only villagers.
An 8-year-old or a 9-year-old can kill you just as quick as a 25 or a 26-year-old man. Back here in the States, the kids are playing cowboys and Indians. Over there, they've been playing it for real.
It was a war with roots deeper than most Americans understood. Ho Chi Minh and his supporters struggled for years, first against the French, then the Americans and their South Vietnamese partners.
I always believed in my country. But instead of sending my sons out to defend their country, I sent them out to die.
It was a war that tore South Vietnam apart. A war that left its mark on the soldiers who served.
GI, you want Vietnamese cigarette? For a box of Tide, you could get a carton of pre-packed, pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes soaked in opium. For $10, you could get a vial of pure heroin. You could get liquid opium, speed, acid, anything you wanted.
It became the first war shown on TV.
What's he got, small arms? Small arms, automatic fire, grenade launcher, and hand grenade.
What's the hardest part of it?
Not knowing where they are, that's the worst.
You lost any friends?
Quite a few. We lost one the other day. The whole thing stinks, you know. We are people. We are saved. It is the time. Are you listening to the next one? Oh, we are saved. Are you listening at noon?
The Vietnam War ended with the fall of Saigon. but the war's legacy remains unresolved.
Well, it's time that we recognized ours was in truth a noble cause. Let us tell those who fought in that war that we will never again ask young men to fight and possibly die in a war our government is afraid to let them win.
Vietnam. Honorable mission, disgraceful mistake. The debate endures for both nations. Not for the hundreds of thousands who escaped the communist regime. Not for the millions still living in a shattered nation, still at war, in Cambodia and against China. This film reflects on a painful era in American history and explores the questions more Americans are now beginning to ask. How we got involved, and what we did there. Two and a half million Americans served in Vietnam. And 58,000 Americans lost their lives. Why? America's conflict in Vietnam spanned 15 years, but the Vietnamese have faced warfare for over 2,000 years. Their longtime foe was China, the massive power to the north. For centuries, Vietnam existed as the southern edge of China's empire. The Vietnamese adopted Chinese ways and beliefs, yet they never gave in to Chinese rule. Even now, across Vietnam, they honor the Trung sisters, who led an uprising against China in the 1st century A.D. Though the revolt failed, the Trung sisters remain national icons, part of Vietnam's long tradition of fighting for independence.
Our history, from the time of the Hung Kings and the Trung sisters to the era of President Ho Chi Minh, has been a history of great struggle. Throughout history, the Vietnamese people have always done their best to defend the country and to build the nation.
They battled nearly 1,000 years after the Trung sisters to drive the Chinese out. Then they moved southward to reach their current borders, subduing other peoples along the way. The nation's rapid growth led to fragmentation and a wave of civil wars. Still, despite internal strife, the Vietnamese viewed themselves as one nation and one people. Yet they remained too divided and weak to resist European conquest in the 1800s. By about 1860, the French occupied the region near Saigon. Over the next 20 years, they took central and northern Vietnam, and by 1885, Vietnam had again lost its independence. By the late 1800s, French Indochina included Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which France split into 3 parts: Cochin China, Annam, and Tonkin. To the Vietnamese, this division aimed to shatter their national identity. The earliest filmed images of these new colonies appeared in the early 1900s. France viewed the Indo-Chinese cultures and saw little that resembled its idea of civilization. The French embraced what they called la mission civilisatrice, the duty to spread civilization and Catholicism to the natives. The Vietnamese, however, resisted this foreign domination. The French labeled all those who resisted as pirates, deploying troops for Vietnam's first pacification. It took 2 decades to suppress Vietnamese resistance. Only then could the French shift focus to colonial economics, aiming to turn Vietnam into a profitable venture. They established factories and expanded northern mining operations. In the south, they built up tea, rubber, and rice plantations. Indochina exported rice to 30 nations, with shipments staying high even when peasants went hungry.
The people here suffered a lot because of high taxes and hard forced labor. They worked from dawn till dusk, but they did not have enough to eat.
A few French firms reaped the profits from cheap labor, despite Indochina being a drain on France's finances. The French state poured millions of francs annually into supporting and protecting the colony, while companies like Michelin Rubber earned millions from their plants and fields. French newsreels showed only neat, modern factories, though Vietnamese workers faced harsh and dehumanizing conditions.
In the rubber plantations, the workers were treated so inhumanely that they died young and died in droves. There was a saying that the workers were fertilizer for the rubber trees, because their corpses were buried under the trees.
Despite this, no major rebellions erupted during these difficult times. Vietnamese society was staggering from the blow of Western influence. French influence filled the cities, introducing Western clothing and thought. Some French intellectuals and artists appreciated Vietnamese culture, and early Western photographers captured scenes of Vietnamese life, yet most French saw themselves as superior. The Vietnamese upper class began sending their sons to Western schools. Nearly all who would later resist French rule were educated by the French. One of them was Ho Chi Minh. Details of Ho Chi Minh's youth remain unclear. He guarded his privacy, rarely gave interviews, and later preferred to appear as the kindly Uncle Ho. Born around 1890 as Nguyen Ai Quoc, he was the son of a Mandarin who quit his job rather than work for the French. As a young adult, Ho left Vietnam and worked aboard ships, and as a cook in the U.S., England, and France. In September 1911, while in Marseille, he wrote the Ministry of Colonies. He expressed a wish to help France in its relations with his people. He also requested admission to a colonial training school. Officials told him to try another institution. By 1917, Ho had relocated to Paris. He adopted the alias Nguyen Ai Quoc, meaning Nguyen the Patriot, and started campaigning for Vietnamese independence. He attempted to present his case at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I, but was denied entry. His efforts won admiration among Vietnamese living in France. His actions drew the attention of the French police. They investigated the young agitator and dismissed him with a report, calling him awkward in appearance, mouth always open with a foolish grin. In 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc helped found the French Communist Party, becoming Vietnam's first communist. He stayed in France, editing an anti-colonial journal called Le Païen, The Outcast, and made a living assisting a photographer. Drawings he published in the paper showed he still cared deeply about Vietnam, though he hadn't returned in 10 years. In 1923, the Communists sent Nguyen Ai Quoc to Moscow for instruction. Later, as a communist operative, he traveled to China. After that, tracking his exact path became difficult. He journeyed across many countries, building a revolutionary network among overseas Vietnamese. Over the next 17 years, he was reported in Germany, China, Thailand, France, and Russia. He wasn't in Vietnam, but his supporters were involved in new uprisings, challenging non-communist groups for influence.
Le 6 février 1930,
On February 6, 1930, the Annamite rebels attacked a military post in Nguyen Bai. And the same day in Hanoi, some rebels attacked police headquarters. They just had a few sardine cans filled with gunpowder and they broke a few windows. I saw the cops in the street and they were all confused, but I said, this is not that serious.
The French crushed the Nguyen Bai Rebellion in just 2 days and jailed its leaders, members of the non-communist VNQDD. Most were executed that June, but resistance spread across several regions, where peasants, often led by the small Indochinese Communist Party, rose up and took land. A devastating famine helped drive the revolts.
Un an après, c'est la révolte de Vinh.
A year later, there was a revolt in Vinh. Drought had struck the province of Vinh, and the peasants, who no longer had anything to eat, sent a delegation to the provincial capital. They asked, as this was a tradition that dated back to the time of the emperors, for a waiver of taxes during the drought. The government rejected this demand and got frightened by this large number of peasants on the roads.
But the crowd continued with the march. They marched all the way to Ben Thuy. And when the first person climbed up a flagpole at the fork in the road at Ben Thuy, the French guards who were on the tower of the Shifa factory shot down at him and killed him. After that, they ordered their soldiers to open fire into the crowd of demonstrators.
Thousands of suspected communists were detained that year, and almost 100 party officials were executed. The Indochinese Communist Party was nearly wiped out.
The Communist Party had been founded in 1930, and in 1931, the French stepped up their repression of revolutionaries. They thought that my brother had put up some red banners. They arrested him along with several hundred peasants who had never done anything wrong at all.
We were kept in underground cells with huge iron bars above us. On top of the cells were cement bridges, along which the French guards marched back and forth, so that in case something happened, they could always pour down bullets on us. I was imprisoned with Comrade Pham Van Dong, and when they tortured us, he told them off in French.
The prisons were schools, places where revolutionaries trained themselves.
The French believed the country had been pacified. Years before, they installed a compliant royal, Khai Dinh, as emperor to legitimize French control. His son, Bao Dai, was sent to France to be educated. Bao Dai remained aboard for a decade, developing a fondness for French wine and earning a playboy reputation. After Khai Dinh died, the young emperor Bao Dai followed orders, attending Parisian functions, hearing French speeches, and doing little for his people during the harshest years of colonial rule. France celebrated its colonial legacy.
Pâté Journal croit nécessaire de présenter ce rapide inventaire de l'œuvre accomplie jusqu'à ce jour à l'abri de nos couleurs. Dans de nombreuses régions, autrefois désertiques, où des tribus hostiles les unes aux autres traînaient une existence misérable, les civilisateurs français ont apporté la paix, le travail, la prospérité, la joie. La France admet comme légitime et heureuse la diversité des civilisations qu'elle respecte. Tout Français est citoyen d'une France mondiale de 100 millions d'habitants. Par son importance et sa fécondité, le domaine français d'outre-mer est devenu un élément essentiel de la vie économique mondiale, une force active de la civilisation, un glorieux témoignage de la grandeur de la France.
But in 1940, that era of French glory came to an end. Japan, expanding its hold on China, aimed to cut off war supplies moving through Vietnam. In June 1940, just 3 days after France surrendered to Nazi Germany, Japan demanded permission to deploy forces in Indochina. With no guidance from Paris, the French governor acted alone.
He thought that to concede a certain number of rights within very specific conditions, while maintaining the principle and form of French sovereignty over Indochina, was the wisest and most appropriate solution in that situation. And indeed, there could be only two solutions: to fight and resist, or to try maintaining the essentials of French sovereignty over Indochina, while sacrificing only a few rights to the Japanese.
A deal was struck. Japanese troops could access airfields and military bases in French Indochina. In return, Japan allowed the French colonial system to keep handling civil affairs, giving the Japanese more time to plan further invasions. Indochina's ports, roads, and railways were vital to Japan's military ambitions, as were its rice, coal, and rubber. For the French, Japan's presence changed little. They remained the only Europeans the Japanese conquerors left at liberty during the war. To the Vietnamese, Japan's arrival made a strong impression. Fellow Asians had ousted European rulers. It was obvious who now held power. To the United States, Japan's moves appeared increasingly threatening. President Roosevelt retaliated by halting scrap metal exports and placing an oil embargo on Japan. In late November 1941, during tense negotiations, the U.S. urged Japan to fully withdraw from Indochina. 10 days later, Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese advanced quickly through Southeast Asia, defeating British, Dutch, and American forces. French Indochina became just one piece of a larger global conflict.
Indochina, and even the other countries of Southeast Asia, were really relatively small potatoes, particularly in connection with the war. I became chief of the Division of Southeast Asian Affairs in the State Department on July 1st, 1944, during the war. There were no activities at the moment that we as a department had to do, but we were concerned to find that I was concerned to learn that the president had already decided that Indochina should be on international trusteeship after the war. He apparently had told a great many people this, that he did not want the French to go back, that they'd been there over 100 years, and the people of Indochina were worse off now than they were then.
Roosevelt delivered different messages to various Allied leaders. Throughout the war, the Allies held conferences and issued statements supporting the right of oppressed nations to choose their own governments. But no one explained how it would be achieved. Roosevelt hesitated to upset Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who resisted ending French colonial rule. Churchill viewed this as the beginning of Britain's own imperial decline.
La France fixe.
General de Gaulle, leading the Free French forces, firmly declared Indochina remained French territory.
Et culturelle de l'Union indochinoise. Elle est et elle restera sa propre mandataire.
Roosevelt postponed a decision. He floated ideas such as an international trusteeship, or one led by the Chinese, or even the French again.
Well, of course, that really meant that he'd abandoned his position. But I think a great deal of that was because of, one, the pressure of the other countries who did not want to have trusteeship for their own territories. They're willing to have trusteeship for any territories of the enemy, but not their own.
By early 1945, the cooperation between Japan and France in Indochina collapsed. Japan's war fortunes were turning for the worse. A small French resistance effort had emerged inside Vietnam. An Allied bombing raid near Saigon unnerved the Japanese.
Le général de Gaulle était extrêmement clair.
General de Gaulle was extremely clear.
Gaulle pensait que
General de Gaulle thought that France could only return to Indochina
les armes à la main,
with arms in hand,
qui supposait donc un combat,
and that implied fighting the Japanese.
Japonais, et les Japonais ont devancé
The Japanese anticipated the fight
en faisant le coup
with the coup of March 9, 1945.
1945.
On that day, Japan acted, overthrowing the French. With remarkable precision, they captured nearly all French soldiers, sparing only a few out on patrol. After enduring great hardship, some survivors eventually made it to China. French authority, preserved in 1940 at the cost of dignity, was now gone. To justify the takeover, the Japanese ambassador approached Emperor Bao Dai, who had stayed in Hue throughout the conflict.
He said to me, yesterday, we terminated French sovereignty. And today, Japan is happy to bring you your independence. We weighed the pros and the cons. What was this independence worth? How should we take it? The ministers told me, Your Majesty cannot refuse this independence, for independence has been a forbidden word for a century.
Japan promoted several nationalist Vietnamese factions, though some opposed both French and Japanese alike. The most prominent was the Viet Minh, created in 1941 by Nguyen Ai Quoc. He had come back to Vietnam after 30 years abroad, adopting a new name, Ho Chi Minh, meaning he who brings light.
After the conference to establish the Viet Minh, Uncle Ho sent out a letter calling for the support of the population. And it was this that rallied the entire country around the movement. And when people realized that Ho Chi Minh was actually Nguyen Ai Quoc, their trust in the movement was further established. This was because the name Nguyen Ai Quoc had been widely known in the country. People knew that he was a great patriot.
Like Ho, many Viet Minh leaders had been part of the old Indochinese Communist Party. However, during the war, the Viet Minh's program was nationalist rather than communist. They built guerrilla bases, trained cadres, harassed both the French and Japanese, and spread propaganda urging peasants to resist.
Why did the Viet Minh fight the Japanese while other Asian nationalists collaborated?
I apologize, but this is a very funny question. At that time, the Japanese had already overthrown the French and begun to dominate our country. So of course we had to fight the Japanese.
By early 1945, Vietnam faced a devastating famine. The people blamed the French and Japanese, who hoarded rice, feeding it to Japanese soldiers and exporting it to Japan, while about 2 million Vietnamese out of 8 million in the north perished.
How come we suffered in 1945? Because of the arrival of the Japanese. The French were already exploiting us. And now, on top of the French, the Japanese were exploiting us.
This is bitterly ironic, because since March 9th, our administration had really stopped working. And especially in getting rice supplies to northern Tonkin. The rice supply was never sufficient, and as we waited for the harvest, food would come on huge junks from Saigon along the coast. And it was, of course, the French administration that set up this supply, whereas the Japanese could not care less. It was not their business.
So many people died of hunger here in this village. I myself had to bury 4 people. And we did not have enough wood to make coffins for them. I had to wrap the 4 corpses I buried with hemp cloth. I buried 4 people in that graveyard over there. In this village, more than 250 people died of hunger. I witnessed families in which every member died.
Lên đến Hà Nội lúc bấy giờ đó, chúng tôi tính giờ là vào khoảng độ.
At that time, in our estimate, at least 40,000 starving, poor peasants arrived in Hanoi.
Lên đến Hà Nội để đi xin ăn,
to beg for food, and to wait for handouts, for alms.
Pháp thì nó không tổ chức.
The French did not organize any hunger relief,
Tổ chức cứu đói cho nhân dân.
and the Japanese specifically forbade us to carry out any hunger relief effort of our own.
Là ở các phố thì bà con là bới những các cái đống
People
rác
dug into the garbage dumps in order to find any edible thing at all.
Rồi sau đó đến
They also ate rats,
bắt chuột mà ăn, nhưng mà cũng
but this was not enough to keep them alive.
sống được. Chúng tôi buổi sáng ra ở những phố đông người, mở cửa ra nhà.
Every morning when we opened our door, we saw 5 to 7 corpses of people who had died the night before.
Nằm chết cóng lúc ban đêm.
The Viet Minh mobilized peasants to seize rice supplies, gaining enormous prestige. This peasant backing gave them a lasting political advantage.
It's a long, tough road to Tokyo. It's longer to go to Tokyo than it is to Berlin, in every sense of the word. The defeat of Germany will not mean the end of the war against Japan.
As the war in Europe ended, Allied focus shifted to Asia and the fight against Japan. One urgent need was intelligence. The Viet Minh trusted Allied promises supporting oppressed people's rights. They had already provided information on Japanese troop movements. So the Americans turned to the Viet Minh and its leader, Ho Chi Minh.
Well, Ho Chi Minh was the name that we ran into occasionally as one of the nationalist leaders among the Vietnamese, leader of a communist group, but we have no idea whether he carried any weight or anything about him until our OSS was actively in the field. And when Ho Chi Minh began his very helpful operation of rescuing downed flyers who had fallen in the jungle.
I first met Ho on the China border between China and Indochina in the last days of April of 1945. He was quite an interesting individual, very sensitive, very gentle, a rather frail type. We spoke quite at length about the general situation, not only in Indochina, but the world at large.
We knew he was a communist, but we also felt, as they did, and the way anybody who has met Ho Chi Minh, that I've ever talked with, had the same feeling, He was first a nationalist and second a communist. That is, he was interested in getting the independence of his people, and then he thought probably the best thing for them was the communist type of government. But he was a nationalist first and foremost.
The Viet Minh agreed to assist the Allies. Major Patty sent a training team called the Deer Mission into the northern mountains.
The Deer team went in and they organized out of about 500 Vietnamese. We selected, with the help of General Giap, selected 200. We spent the next 4 weeks training these young men into the art of using automatic weapons, demolition equipment, and the infiltrating and exfiltrating into various dangerous areas. There, for the first time, we saw what kind of troops the Viet Minh were. They were very willing, fine, young nationalists, really what we used to say gung-ho type. They were willing to risk their lives for their cause, the cause of independence against the French.
Before Ho's forces could fully demonstrate their loyalty, World War II ended suddenly. The unexpected Japanese defeat surprised many in French Indochina, but the Viet Minh were prepared for what they called the August Revolution. They declared Vietnam independent and peacefully entered Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh established a government in Hanoi, including members from other nationalist groups. However, in the south, beyond Ho's moderating reach, his followers began purging rival nationalists.
En réalité, je ne connaissais pas ce gouvernement.
In reality, I did not know this government in Hanoi.
Un jour, j'ai reçu un télégramme émanant de toutes les couches de population.
But one day, I received a telegram from all levels of the population asking me to make a historic gesture, that is, to resign.
Ces gens-là croyaient que
these people believed that
moi présent sur le trône,
if I were to stay on the throne,
n'avais pas la confiance des alliés.
The Allies would not trust me.
Alors ils ont cru que le gouvernement.
They believed that the government of Ho Chi Minh had the support of the Americans.
Avait l'appui des Américains.
The emperor stepped down. The OSS remained involved with the Viet Minh, possibly reinforcing hopes of American backing.
2 or 3 days after I met Ho, he asked me to come in and stop in and see him, at which time he wanted to show me something. And what he wanted to show me was a draft of the Declaration of Independence that he was going to declare several days later. Of course, it was in Vietnamese and I couldn't read it. And when it was interpreted to me, I was quite taken aback to hear the words of the American Declaration of Independence. Words about liberty, life, the pursuit of happiness, etc. I just couldn't believe my own ears.
On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan officially surrendered. And on that very day, across Vietnam, the people celebrated their self-declared Independence Day and the creation of a new nation, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh delivered a speech starting with, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights."
Vì vậy đó, đến khi mà Hồ Chủ tịch lên lễ đài đó.
I can say that the most moving moment was when President Ho Chi Minh climbed the steps and the national anthem was sung. It was the first time that the national anthem of Vietnam was sung in an official ceremony. Uncle Ho then read the Declaration of Independence, which was a short document. As he was reading, Uncle Ho stopped and asked, "Compatriots, can you hear me?" This simple question went into the hearts of everyone there. After a moment of silence, they all shouted, "Yes, we hear you." And I can say that we did not just shout with our mouths, but with all our hearts, the hearts of over 400,000 people standing in the square then. After Uncle Ho finished reading the Declaration of Independence, an airplane, a small one, circled over us. We did not know whose plane it was. We thought that it was a Vietnamese plane, but when it swooped down over us, we recognized the American flag. The crowd cheered enthusiastically.
Ho Chi Minh was on a silver platter in 1945. We had him. He was leaning not towards the Soviet Union, which at the time he told me that the USSR could not assist him because they had just won a war only by dint of real heroism, and they were in no position to help anyone. So really, we had Ho Chi Minh, we had the Viet Minh, we had the Indochina question in our hand.
Few American officials agreed with Major Patty's view. Ho reached out to President Harry Truman, though he probably would have welcomed any support. Truman did not reply to Ho's letters. Having been in office only 4 months by August 1945, he had not yet formed a clear policy on Indochina.
There was quite a division in the State Department over Indochina. Both the Far Eastern Office and the European Office were in complete agreement that we wanted a strong France recovered in Europe from the trauma of Vichy and the defeat in the war. But the European division felt to help get the French back on their feet, we should go along with practically anything that the French wanted. We in Southeast Asia division and the Far Eastern Office, on the other hand, were very conscious of the tremendous surge of nationalism that was taking place, had already started before the war, and now had been thrust forward at accelerated speed during the war. And the result was the department had no official policy towards Indochina.
The Allies had arranged a compromise to disarm the Japanese. North of the 16th parallel, Chinese forces would accept the Japanese surrender. In the south, the British were tasked with the same duty. They arrived in Saigon early September.
We had come out of Burma, and it was literally like going into a beautiful slice of Paris. It was a wonderful experience after what we had been through, and I think that we had not been warned that there was a political situation, or potential political situation on our hands, and we were driven into Saigon. And there were banners out saying, "Welcome to the Allied Commission," in English. The situation was apparently completely peaceful. Then the local people, who we came to know as the Annamites, started digging up the road at night. You'd be driving along and suddenly a tree would drop in front of you. And it moved on from there to a situation where there was a lot of incendiarism at night, and we were rushing troops from one point to another, becoming a more difficult situation.
The British commander, General Douglas Gracie, was an experienced colonial officer with little political skill. His orders were to disarm the Japanese and keep law and order. Among his staff was Brigadier D.E. Taunton.
It was a very difficult period for me at that time. The Japanese were in control and were armed. The French were imprisoned by the Japanese, and my job was to release them, and the Annamites appeared to be in control of government buildings and so on and so forth. So I went through a very difficult period of trying to rearm the French, trying to disarm the Annamites, and not bothering very much about the Japanese, who were well behaved, and I left them with their small arms for a while.
He did everything possible to destroy our administration in order to reinstall a pro-French administration. To do this, he intentionally went against Allied orders to disarm the 100,000 Japanese troops. Instead of disarming them, he disarmed us, the revolutionary forces of Vietnam. He used the Japanese troops and rearmed the French Legionnaire regiments to fight against the Vietnamese Revolution.
And everything got a bit out of hand. And the only logical thing to do was to rearm the Japanese, who were highly trained, they had surrendered, and they were at that time reliable. It was a bit odd to do it, I admit that, but it worked.
How did you feel? Did you approve?
I personally thought it was the right thing to do, because I had been dealing with the Japanese quite a lot, answering their problems about terms of surrender and so on and so forth, and I felt it was far better, and I felt happier, to have rearmed Japanese in control of the key points, rather than trigger-happy and untrained Frenchmen, as some of they were, running about and offering themselves as targets to the Annamites, and the Annamites taking full advantage of it.
We did everything possible to accommodate Gracie. He came here with only 2 battalions of Indian troops. It was not a formidable force, but we still did our best to help him. We turned over our headquarters to him, and we enabled his troops to move about freely. Then he forbade us to move around and imposed a curfew. But Gracie's troops and the Japanese soldiers could move around, and he took advantage of this to mount a sneak attack on us on September 23rd.
The orders, as I remember them, were on the 23rd, the French would take over certain key points quickly, quietly, from the Annamites, assisted by my troops when necessary. My troops would also take over the bank and the post office, and all this would be achieved quietly in the night. It went perfectly quietly and all right, but it broke down as the day went on the following day, that the French, as I said earlier, became overexcited and all sorts of shooting and noise was going on.
The day following the coup, French troops, freed from months of Japanese imprisonment, went on a violent spree, arresting and attacking Vietnamese. Despite the chaos, General Gracie and his forces firmly believed that legitimate government had returned to Saigon.
He had absolutely no mandate whatever to start talking about handing over French Indochina to anybody other than the French. He had his strict instructions.
I never lost the impression that in due course the French would have to take over control and responsibility when they were in a position and strong enough to do so. I never entered my head that I was going to hand back control to Annamites.
It was an obvious move that they were going to restore the French to power in Indochina. I think our European division probably silently applauded. We silently gnashed our teeth, and but there was nothing that we could do about it. This was a theater which we really only had nominal participation in, and so we just had to watch.
America's surveillance was handled by OSS agents. One of them, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey, particularly irritated the French representative, Colonel Sedia, and General Gracie.
When Gracie and the French representative found out that we were meeting with Dewey, they were extremely angry. And although they did not say it publicly, they showed that they were clearly against the activities of Dewey.
Colonel Dewey of the OSS was a law to himself. He had arrived and attached himself to the Control Commission, I think a little to Sedill's surprise as well as Grace's surprise, and he was a man who acted always on his own.
Relations between the OSS team and General Gracie worsened. After a dispute over who had authority to fly a flag on his car, Gracie either suggested or ordered, it's unclear which, that Peter Dewey leave Saigon. On September 26th, Colonel Dewey departed with his friend, Captain Bluchel, in a jeep that was poorly marked.
As we were driving along, we came to a corner, we had to turn to the right, and about 10 yards further down, as we turned, we encountered a roadblock consisting of logs and little brush. Nothing formidable, but it necessitated for us to make a reverse S to get through. This was alongside the golf course, Saigon golf course. So as we're going through the S part of the roadblock, we saw 3 enemies in the ditch to our left. So Peter shook his fist at him and yelled something in French. But what he said, I don't know because I don't speak French or understand it. At that point, a machine gun opened fire. And the burst hit Peter Dewey right in the head, back of the head. It looked like part of his lower jaw had been shot away, and the Jeep continued then towards the ditch and rolled over on its side. Firing continued, but the chassis of the Jeep protected me. The machine gun burst didn't touch me. Just lucky. I don't know how I didn't.
We tried our best to find out what happened, but there was nothing we could do, and it was a question as to whether there was anything we should try to do, because I say that was a case of a murder rather than a military action.
Turns out that Peter Dewey was the first American to be killed in Vietnam.
I grew up in Bremen, Georgia, about an hour west of here. Graduated from high school there. Came to Georgia Tech 1952. Met Pat Epps along the way. We graduated in 1956. I had been accepted for pilot training with the Air Force after ROTC, but was delayed for a year to go on active duty. So I worked for Lockheed out here in Marietta. And then in 1957, I entered pilot training down in Bainbridge, Georgia. I was very fortunate, flew the first group that flew the T-37. Went from there to Laredo, Texas, T-33, and got my wings. Came back to Moody Air Force Base flying F-86Ls.
What put you on a track to go into ROTC and then into the Air Force? Is that something you wanted to do since you were a kid, or when did that kick in for you?
Well, growing up during World War II, formative years, I heard about these guys, flying tigers, running around China, strafing trains and doing things in the big raids. And I thought that must be really neat. But I never thought I'd get a chance at it until I got to Tech and found out there was ROTC and that I could have a chance.
And what made you choose Tech?
Probably because of the football team right then. Plus, my next door neighbor was a ham radio operator, and he convinced me that if I went to Tech and got an electrical engineering degree, my future was secure.
At what point in your Air Force career did you get introduced to the F-105?
I was in graduate school at Southern California in 1965-66. And while I was there, I was thinking I'm going to miss out on this war because I had a lot of friends that already had assignments. But I received an assignment at the time before I finished out there for the 105. And the sequence of events was I'd go to survival school at the completion and then to Nellis Air Force Base and check out in the 105 to go to Tak Lee, Thailand.
So when you were at Nellis, how often did you get into Las Vegas?
Surprisingly, I didn't go down there as much as you'd think during that time. We were pretty busy. I went out a few times to make sure I wasn't going to win any extra money.
Tell me as much as you can remember about your journey to Vietnam. How did they get you over there? Did you fly an airplane over there, or did they ship you some other way? Just tell us about going to Vietnam and your first impressions of being there.
Okay. I left from Fort Walton Beach, Eglin Air Force Base, in the end of March 1967. I flew commercially to San Francisco and then up to Travis Air Force Base, where I was on a military contract flight that island hopped to the Philippines, Clark Air Base, and I went through jungle survival school there for about 10 days. And then I flew again on a contract flight to Bangkok, and then on a military airplane, C-47, the old Goonie Bird, up to Tak Lee.
And what do you remember about stepping off an airplane for the first time?
I had a very memorable introduction. The fellow who was the ops officer for my squadron and the one who became my flight commander subsequently said, "Welcome to the 354th, the highest loss rate squadron in Southeast Asia." Yeah, what a good deal. And about a week later, I went up and met with the wing commander who welcomed the new people, and he told us that in 2 years of operation, the track record was in the 100 missions or 1 year tour, you had a 50-50 chance of being shot down. If you were shot down, you had a 50-50 chance of being rescued. Welcome to the war.
You know, most pilots are in love with the airplane that they flew, but some of those loss rates had to do with the airplane you were flying, correct?
The loss rate, I think, was primarily the mission. But backing up, when I was in graduate school and we knew people were getting assignments, I had volunteered or indicated an interest in every airplane in Southeast Asia except the F-105. And that was based on a briefing from Colonel Yeager when he was head of the test pilot school. He described it as an electronic monster. Can't understand why the Air Force wasted their money on this thing. So I was not particularly happy when I got my assignment. But by the time I checked out in the airplane and started flying it, I started to really like it. By the time I left to go to war, I won't say I was in love with it, but I was proud I was flying it. And the more I flew it, the prouder I was. But our mission, since we only flew in North Vietnam, made us extremely vulnerable. We didn't have much, milk runs. Maybe on a bad weather day, you'd do a recce down in Route Pack 1 north of the DMZ. And that was pretty easy, but I was on my 47th mission and 31 of them were in the Hanoi area. I'd already beaten the odds 2 or 3 times. I never got to meet Colonel Oles, but he was the commander of the 8th Wing over at Ubon when I was flying, and they flew MidCap on several missions into Hanoi that I was on. But I did not meet him personally until after the war.
So, obviously your missions were into dangerous territory, and I've read that, well, I won't get into reasons, but because of our unwillingness to stop the stuff coming in from the Russians, they had a very robust anti-aircraft defense system. So I imagine every mission was just tremendously high risk.
There were a few missions like when we would do road recce or just general reconnaissance missions down in the lower route packs 1, 2, or 3 that were you almost say were fun. Go out and roam around and see the countryside while you were doing it. But yes, when we went into the Hanoi area, the expression was when you got up there, your ass belongs to Uncle Sam, put those bums on target. And there were some missions that everything's there. We went in, at the time I was there, we'd make run-ins at low altitude, around 1,500, 2,000 feet, to try to stay out of the radar for the sounds and the radar guns. Therefore, small arms fire was a risk that you had to avoid. But yeah, in the pattern that we flew, we'd pull up to about 14,000 feet and then come back in on a dive. And that's when the radar could pick you up. Where the first month or so I was there, where the MiGs would be laying for us right over Hanoi. And one mission I was on, we had MiGs going up with us in the pop. We had 105s and MiGs and 105s and MiGs, and SAMs going off and flak all around. I don't know who the MiG leader was that day, but he wasn't too smart. Oh, you could almost watch a gauge drop. I used to laugh. Say, put your hand on the floorboard, you could feel it going by. I'm trying to think. Typical fuel consumption was probably about 3,000 gallons or pounds an hour. The afterburner jumped to a little over 6,000.
So you didn't do that unless you meant it?
No. The best I did, I guess I got it about 1.3 or 4. But that's an interesting story if you want to put on.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd love to hear it.
We were on a mission on Sunday afternoon in a railroad yard just northeast of Hanoi, across the Red River Bridge there. And my flight leader, we were the #1 bomb flight, and there was a flak suppression flight ahead of us, and the #4 guy there had been hit and was going down under the clouds. We had about a 2,000 foot level layer. And so my flight leader says, I'm going to follow him down. So that meant me leading the mission out. And about the time I got out and got to recover right across Hanoi, and that's where we were in afterburner, accelerating out of there and jinking. A SAM went off so close that I flew through the colored cloud, which only lasted a couple of seconds. And I came back and I told him that day, I said, I think the biggest damage I did was going across Hanoi supersonic, blowing out all the windows in town. But as we got out, I was starting to climb out, and a fellow from up here in Georgia who happened to be in my squadron too, I recognized his voice, called me and he says, single 105, 18 east of 97, shake it, you got a MiG on you. So I did a split S right down through the cloud layer, pulled up, and when I did and looked out, there was a mountain ridge on either side of me out here, at least 500 feet higher than me. And I came back out of there rather subdued, to say the least. And I remember I got back and went through debriefing. And intelligence at that time, if you had a tough mission, they'd pull out this bottle of bourbon, old Overholzer, I remember, and they'd give you a shot. And I threw that one down, and I started telling him about the mission. He pulled us, "You like another?" And I said, "Yeah." And I says, "Can I have another one?" I had my third shot of bourbon. We got through the debrief, and I looked at my watch. It was about 5 minutes till evening church time. And I went down to the chapel. I knew this Methodist minister was down there, and I leaned up and right up in his face. I said, it was a close one today, but he got me back here. I said, you think I'll be okay here? He says, you'll be glad you're here. Come on in. But that was probably my most exciting day, other than being shot down.
I guess a day you probably don't enjoy talking about, but I hope you will, July 5th, 1967. And maybe, you know, I'd love for people who, particularly young people, to understand what your day was like. Not just the fact that you were shot down, but your usual day and preparing for a mission. And all you can remember about that day would be wonderful.
I don't have any trouble talking about it. July the 5th, 1967 was obviously a very special day. And 2 or 3 things led up to that, in that I had just been appointed or signed as the executive officer of the squadron, and we were having an inspection. We had a new commander, he asked me to do a check around to make sure we were ready and get acquainted myself. So I had not flown for 3 days. I had sat as spare when they needed, but I didn't get off. And I remember on the night of the 4th of July, I wrote a letter home, and I said, well, I missed the fireworks again today, but Fergie promised me tomorrow for sure. And sure enough, I went out on the afternoon mission. I dropped that report off on the commander's desk and headed out. And later on, talking to people in Hanoi when we were together, almost without exception, all of us acknowledged there was something different about the way we felt that day. We couldn't put our finger on it, but it wasn't like a normal day. And I kept trying to think the whole time, what have I forgotten? What did I do or not do, or what? And as it turns out, obviously it was that sense, I guess, of the impending, what was imminent. But in my case, I was the number 4 airplane in a second flight on a railroad siding right up near the Chinese border. And just as we started our roll-in of the first flight, there was a call for MiGs about 20 miles west of us at our altitude. So as number 4, that's part of my responsibility. So I took a quick look out there to see if I could pick them up. And I didn't see anything, but when I looked back, my leader had already started rolling in, and the flak was so thick that I couldn't see down. So I had to stay up till some bombs went off and I could see the target. Consequently, I had to adjust my roll-in. Instead of being in a 45-degree dive, I was probably at least 60 coming straight down, and I had to adjust the altitude, drop the bombs. And I flew through 3 levels. They were laying out flak at level 3, about 3,000 feet apart. I made it through the 3 of the levels of flak. But just as my bombs came off, I felt a hit. I'd been hit twice before, so it was unmistakable. But this time, my procedure was when I dropped the bombs, was hit the afterburner, pull out, let that give me the thrust, and start my jinking. Well, when I hit the afterburner, the airplane just did a tumble. And I came back out, it stabilized, and I remember this distinctly. Boy, that'd be a heck of a ride at Coney Island. I'd never been there, but I'd heard about it. So I relaxed, put the burner back in, get out of here, and the airplane just started flipping and tumbling. And I couldn't see out because of the flames, but I was still going to try to make it as close as I could to the water. We'd come in off the Gulf, and we're going back out that way. But about that time, the camera up in front of the dash, under the windscreen, broke loose, and I had to duck as it went over my head. And as I was looking, the instrument panel just started crumbling, and the airplane was starting to come apart. So I leaned back, put myself in position, pulled the handles, and I remember thinking nothing happened. And boom, it's gone. And I had a very interesting experience in that I grayed out. I couldn't see anything, didn't feel anything. I was just kind of floating. I thought I was dead, literally. And then I started feeling some pressure, and my vision started coming back, and I could see a little bit of green. And then all of a sudden I could see the canopy of, the tops of the trees, and I'm coming down. And I looked up to see if the canopy was open, and it was just starting to blossom. And I reached up to get it, and when I put my hands on the risers, they collapsed. I was sitting on a log on the ground. And that all took less than 2 seconds, because had those automatic systems that got me out, pull to shoot, not worked, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. I figure I went out inverted in negative G's and probably maybe even ejected toward the ground. I don't know. No idea. But somebody up there was looking out for me that day again, like the day that over Hanoi supersonic.
You're not any place you want to be.
Well, the first thing, obviously, that I did once I was on the ground, sitting on the log, my emergency beeper was going off. Get that off so I can talk. But I couldn't get up to it. I couldn't get it cut off. I didn't think. I realized after the fact that I had because 2 others had been shot down, and their beepers were the ones that were going off blocking things. But I made an immediate call, told them I was down safe, I'd check in an hour. That's really optimistic. But sitting on the log looking down was kind of ironic. I looked down and looked at the tree. This is just like North Georgia. Those hills, same kind of scrub trees and pine tree and running around, the ground's gravelly. Then all of a sudden it dawned on me, these ain't going to be friendly North Georgia mountaineers. Everybody I see now may be looking to kill me. So I started trying to get rid of stuff. My chute was caught in the trees. I couldn't get it down. My survival kit that comes out separately had banged down, and I couldn't get it open. But I could get the side open that had the jungle hat with a mosquito net and a bottle, 2 cans of water. And I pulled out the water, stuck them in my flight suit, put the hat on, threw my helmet down the hill, hoping that would make them think I'd gone that way. And I started up the hill, which was the instructions or recommendations from survival school. And as I got to almost to the top of the hill, and I could see a path out here that I was going to go to, I hesitated just long enough. I think actually my G-suit got caught in some brambles and kept me from pushing these bushes open, and a Vietnamese ran across closer than 4 feet away. The only thing, he was in a hurry or didn't look my way. So that caused me to look around a little bit and the path, and then I saw these field wires across the way. When I leaned up and looked, I'd come down right in the gun ring. There was a gun sight down here about 100 yards and another one over here about 100, 150. And so I reconsidered my actions at this point, don't get too carried away. But I managed to get across that path without leaving a track with the boots. And I thought if I got over on the other side and down the hill, I could hide out for that hour and check in and maybe get picked up, get out of here. And I didn't realize when I got across, all the brush was over here. I was in grass, maybe a foot, 1.5 feet high. And when I got to the edge and looked down, it was a drop off into a bog. I wasn't going anywhere in that direction. So I sat down and opened one of the cans of water, and at that point I was so thirsty I didn't think there was enough water around. I took 2 sips, and I thought it was going to come out my ears, all the psychological, the shock effects. But I managed to drink it, forced it down, threw the can away, and about that time I heard voices were gathering up over here along the trail. And they were pointing and talking, and I'd heard some shots and hollering back and forth. They'd obviously found my parachute and helmet. And so they'd eliminated that side. They just really were going to come over here. And they did, and they came out. And I did this and tried to get anything white out of sight and hide down. But it turned out I wasn't going to hide under anything. They walked up and tapped me on the shoulder and welcomed me to North Vietnam. The ones that came out and got me were actually militia. They were in civilian clothes. One of them had a rifle.
I don't mean to interrupt, but these are regular North Vietnamese.
No, these are civilian. They're like militia.
Oh, okay.
They're in civilian clothes. I don't know how they fit into the system right there then, but like I say, one of them had a rifle, and they started stripping me down. And, of course, when I got my pistol out over here, one of them pulls it out and looks at it. And I don't know why, it was just a sixth sense. I just happened to glance up just as he was starting to come across and hit me in the head, and I ducked and missed him. And the guy with the rifle leaned across and hit him with a butt in his chest and knocked him back. And I remember thinking, you and I are going to be friends. I don't know about the others, but I like you. But they packed me down. Well, they started me, took off my boots, stripped out everything out of the flight suit. One amusing thing, I carried a half a pack of Salems because we'd been told that Ho Chi Minh liked those, and if Ho Chi Minh did, most everybody else probably would. And I carried some Winston cigarettes too. They pulled the cigarettes out, looked at them, crumbled them up, and threw them away. And I said, well, so much for intelligence. But they started walking me, and I realized if I walked very far barefooted, my feet were not going to be in a condition to do anything else. So as we started down the trail, I started watching and I saw a root coming up, and I hooked my foot in it and fell over and convinced them that I'd hurt myself. And I got them to carry me all the way down the side of the mountain. And we stopped in a little village. They put me in a house in the back corner on a bed. And I was there, I'd say, between 30 minutes and an hour, and he came in, tapped out, and walked back out. And I got in this, I called it a safari wagon. It was bigger than a Jeep, but not as big as you see safaris nowadays, but open vehicle with a canvas top. And they put me in the back seat, one guy on each side. They're holding my arms like this, I wasn't tied up. But I looked up as the fellow on my left in English said, "You're now the prisoner of the Chinese Liberation Army." And what I saw in front was a picture of Mao Zedong and Lin Pao, head of the premier and the head of the People's Army. And I couldn't put my hand up and do the Marine salute, but I said something, well, okay, you really did it to yourself this time. Because I figured I was gone to China because we were that close to the border. I learned over the next 24 hours that that's why the gun sights were so good down there. The Chinese were running them all. And what we had rolled in over, literally, that got us was what we considered probably the best gun sight in North Vietnam. Of course, now I knew why. And later, in '79, when Deng Xiaoping came to this country, he acknowledged that they had 300,000 regular troops in North Vietnam for the war. So that's what they were doing. And it was also why we had been briefed about 2 or 3 weeks before that there would be no attempted rescues in the buffer zone right up near the border. That they finally acknowledged that those were the Chinese. And I'd have to say that overall, I was well treated with them. They brought me something to eat. They wanted me to do a radio broadcast, which I declined with no pressure. And that night, the commandant came in. They introduced him as the commandant. And through the translator said that if I cooperated with them, that I would be treated well, and I'd be taken to Beijing and be treated well. And I declined that kind offer also, because in 1967, Beijing and the moon were about the same distance from Atlanta, Georgia, as far as I was concerned. I did not know, I should say, that we had an F-104 pilot had been shot down in September of '65 who was already in Beijing. And he came home when we did, and I introduced myself to him and told him my opportunity to meet him. He said, "You made a good choice." He spent 7.5 years in solitary. And after during the 24 hours with the Chinese, when I knew, they took me around the next day to various gun sites. We'd stop someplace, and about 8 or 10 guys would come out in uniform and line up. And I called him the cheerleader. The head guy would get out his little red book, and he'd read and chant and read, and he'd chant. And the translator then would say, "The U.S. will surely be defeated. The Vietnamese people will surely be victorious." Okay, that's nice. And one thing out of that, which really surprised me, was that almost every one of these guys had a camera. And when the chanting and cheerleading was all over, they'd all gang around there, all making pictures. So I had my fingers crossed that somebody was going to make a picture to get out, because I knew with my close call I was probably going to be reported as killed in action. So I cooperated with the picture making at that point as much as possible. But that afternoon, they took me up to a place, I guess it was either a subordinate or a corresponding headquarters, where I met some more regular Army. And I had, I guess you would say, a test of wills. They started the chanting again, and this time they wanted me to say it. And I told them, no, I'm not going to say that. And one of the guys, I don't know what they smoked, but his eyes showed he had something more than an issue, maybe my old Overholser. But he comes up with his rifle and puts the bayonet right under my chin and pops it up like that. While the translator's right here saying, "You must say it." And I wouldn't shake my head. I just did kind of like that. And after 2 or 3 times like that, and for him saying, "You must say it," I finally just did my lips tightly. I grinned, so I'm not going to say that. And an officer obviously came up and got this guy to back off with a rifle. But I wasn't too sure there for a while because I could see the rifle bore was clean. It was operable. But once that was over, back in the truck, back down to where I'd been before, in an area with a cave. That was my house right then. And they let me take a nap, and the commander came by and motioned like that and went out and got in the truck and went down, and they turned me over to the North Vietnamese. And I remember when they made that offer and to go to Beijing, I said, no, I want to go to Hanoi. The guy looked at me and just kind of shook his head. So when he turned me over, I leaned back out and I wanted to shake hands with him, and we did, which is part of the story because I hope to meet him later on. But anyway, the Vietnamese blindfolded me, and took me down, I'm pretty confident, to Kelp Airfield. And I got a jet helicopter ride into Gia Lam, right downtown, and then a truck ride across the river to the big prison, Hoa Lo. We referred to Hoa Lo as the Hanoi Hilton,
Oh, that's
but
Hilton.
but also
Yeah.
Hanoi Hilton tends to encompass all the camps. If you were in Hanoi, you were in the Hilton, although everybody, with few exceptions, processed through the big prison initially. And I went into New Guy Village there, learned I wasn't nearly as big, mean, and tough and strong as I thought I was. A couple of little fellas with a rope can get you to do and say things that you didn't plan to. And another one that got my arms up behind me for the better part of a day, convinced me to do some things. It had been opened in, I think, summer, June, July area of '66. And they called it the farm because out the edge of town, and you could hear the chickens and the animals and things around, and they named the buildings for things like the barn and the stable and the chicken coop. And it was an old French movie studio, so there was a theater there, that was obvious. They had a swimming pool, and one was a pool hall. So all those names fit in. But one of the guys that was living in front of the pool hall was a real character. One day, well, almost all the doors had these little openings in them. We call them peeps for short. And that's what they'd open up and look, check on you every morning and during the day or at night or whatever. One of the guards came by one day and did that. And after he walked off, this fella tapped to his neighbor next door, says, "The first zoo I've ever been in where the animals look at the people." And from then on, it was the zoo. After the zoo, sometime during the summer of '70, the Vietnamese were readying a new facility for us at an existing army post out again to the west of Hanoi. And they had moved at least 2 groups in there earlier, one of them from the from the San Tay prison where the raid took place later on. But it was the first time we had had compound living, so to speak. It was a big, long barracks that was divided into several rooms. Excuse me. But after a few days, we were all out together. They'd come in, just unlock the doors in the morning. We had to run to the place till siesta time, noonish, when they'd put us back in for a couple hours, and then we'd be back out. We had to run to the place till time to lock up to go to bed. We had a latrine area and a shower area, It definitely, it was not Hogan's Heroes, but it was so much better than anything we had had. We're getting sunshine, exercise, and then the Sante raid popped in, and that was about 6, 7 miles away. We heard all the fireworks and see the airplanes and activity, and it scared the bejesus out of the Vietnamese. 2 days later, we were all loaded up, now taken back down to the big prison, Wallow, downtown. And they had opened up an area in the back that we knew was back there because when I was there before, we could hear people back in there. They'd been using it for political prisoners as well as South Vietnamese prisoners they'd captured. And these cell blocks were roughly 25 feet by about 55 or 60. And they had up to 100 to 120 South Vietnamese in each one, and there were 50 to 57 of us in each one. And on the concrete slabs, you had about that much space. And we then had guys laying on bedboards around on the floor. It was a crowded sardine can, but it was so nice to be with people that you'd only heard names of for several years, but now you got a face to go with them, a personality, and you got new people to talk to and new stories to hear. And it was actually fun for a few days. The first stop that I made when we went out to the zoo was in an area that we called the Annex. There was a series of buildings, I think there were 9 or 10 of them, where they stored the film from the studio. And in fact, there were old rolls of film around and so on. And I was in this group of 3 other F-105 pilots that had been shot down in early October. We'd gotten there in late October. But none of us knew anything about the tap code. We'd tried to talk across the wall or do something to the group that was next to us. There were 2 units in each building, but we weren't getting anywhere until the next spring, like March. This Navy lieutenant commander came in who knew the code. He had heard it, but he hadn't had a chance to use it, wasn't very good at it. But we were over trying to get the guys next door to respond. And they were tapping on the wall, and we were giving names, and they were giving their names back.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but how did the code work? Was it a form of Morse code, or
no?
How did you know which letter was what tap?
Well, the quick background is one of the very early Air Force officers, I think he was number 6 or 7, shot down, had been talking to a German POW, one of ours who was a German POW in World War II, and talked about this code. And Smitty asked him, what is it? Is it Morse code? No, it's a little matrix, 5 by 5. Excuse me. You drop out the letter K because you can get the same sound using a C. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right on down. And to tap it, you tap, the first tap is for the row, and the second tap's for the column. So a B would be 1, 2, 2. And my initial W, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, dot, dot. A, dot, dot. And it seems cumbersome till you get it and get going. And once you get established doing it, it's like a lot of other things. You pick up a word from the context and you can get them to go on. And you can do it even faster than the telegraph key, I think. It was a lifesaver for us. But this first effort was really cumbersome. And when they were given their names back, this one came out, as I mentioned, there's no K, you use the C. It came back H-I-C-C-E, something that doesn't make any sense. So you didn't give him an error and get him to do it again. And about the 3rd time, I don't know why it popped in my mind. I said H-I-C, and then all of a sudden I remembered saying, ask if that's Jim. And so he went back, Jim, it came back, yes, and it's Jim Hickerson. And we had been fraternity brothers down here at Georgia Tech, stood side by side at initiation. He went in the Navy right away when I had that delay at Lockheed, but we'd seen each other about 2 years after. Both of us had our wings, but that would have been 10 years later right there in Hanoi. But it was after he and I were then moved, as we call it, across the wall into the main prison, he was up in the barn and I was in the pool hall. So we didn't communicate until about 2 years later, when we had what I call a fruit basket turnover, and he moved in next door to me, and they'd taken some of the bricks out of the windows, and I got to lean in and shake hands with him. But then when we went out to the camp we call Faith at the compound living, and then back into the other, we stayed together for the next 2.5, almost 2 years.
Thinking about the whole experience, you had to go through a range of, I shouldn't say you had to, I would imagine you went through a range of emotions.
Definitely.
In the beginning, you're a new opportunity for them. And then there must reach a point where the enemy says, we've done everything with this guy that's of value to us we can do, and now you just become, I shouldn't say just become, now you're a prisoner. When you think back, I mean, there had to be fear, boredom, hunger. I mean, how do you describe the stages of your imprisonment and what it did to you?
Well, first off was the startling realization that Air Force intelligence at survival school was out of touch with the real world. Because I asked the question as part of the process, what do you know about the POWs? So you're probably aware of the Hanoi March that had happened in the summer of '66. Oh, and by the way, one of the Navy guys was shot down a couple of days before that happened, and they put him in. He got down and got to prison, and his quote was one of the famous ones. He said, "You guys do this very often?" But I was concerned about it, and the sergeant told me in the Philippines, "Oh, we've had reports of really good treatment up there." Because they've been seen out in town at night and in restaurants and theaters and stuff. And I'd been there about a week when I settled down enough, wish I could get my hands on that sergeant again. And also a Marine from Korea. But anyway, I was not prepared for the immediate torture, to be candid. Obviously, in survival school, we were taught name, rank, serial number, date of birth, according to the code of conduct, and evade further question to the best of your ability. But a German POW fellow, U.S. Air Force, who had been German POW when I was there, made the statement that if you have something that they want, they will get it. If you're by yourself, they'll get it out of you. If they're more than one, beware of things they'll do to play you off each other to get it. So once I got the name, rank, serial number, date of birth, and he said, "What was your target?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And his English wasn't that good, but I could understand it. But I used the fact that I couldn't to get him to repeat things to buy time to think about what I was doing and saying. But anyway, he let me know right away that name, rank, serial number is not going to cut it. Oh, in fact, that's one of the humorous things. I told you about faking that injury up in the mountain to get them to carry me. I tried the same thing with the Chinese. They brought in a doctor. He checked me out. Said, "No, you're okay." I said, "No, Deep, no, you're okay." When I get to Hanoi, now I'm in a new venue. So when the interrogator comes in, he says, "Sit." And he was at a table with this light little gooseneck thing down here with a stool down. He says, "Sit." So I start like I'm going to hobble over there. And he looks up and he says, "Maybe you best actor in survival school, but now you in Hanoi. Sit down." That alerted me. This guy is not a dummy. He's in touch. And over the course of the night, he convinced me that their intelligence was immediately up to date. He asked me 2 questions over the course. One I'd been briefed on it the day before I was shot down, and one the day I was shot down as top secret. And he asked me why this happened. First one was why the 104 or the F4s no longer fly MiG cap. And I said, you mean they weren't up there today? I thought they were. And then he says, why can you not fly over Hanoi below 10,000 feet now? And we'd just been briefed on that day because there's a French delegation in town. So once that confirmed, that I got to be serious about this. And when he was asking these questions, what was your target? I said, I don't know. I was a spare. I pulled in. I just followed them. Who else was in your flight? I don't know. Who's in your squadron? Well, I'm new. I've only been there a short time. He kept pressing for names, so I started coming up with guys from high school and from tech who were 4F or never in. I threw in some names of guys that had finished 100 mission and gone home to be good. And I kept cranking this, and finally, after I don't know how many hours, and several times of tying me up and passing out and coming back to consciousness, he said, why do you keep lying? I said, I'm not lying. He said, yeah, you lie. Same day we shoot down man 357 Squadron, tells us everything. And I thought about that a minute, and I said, well, if he tells you, why you ask me? He said, I want to hear you say. So we're back to the game again. Name, rank, serial number, write down all the same questions. And I remember from survival school, if you're telling a lie and somebody else telling the truth, the liar's in trouble. And I thought, oh gosh, if he really did tell them, I'm in trouble. So I started pulling my answers back to more factual things, but not quite as best I could, but sweating it out. And finally, when he quit about daylight, and this had started a little after dark the night before, and I got the day off, and I lay there, and they brought me some soup and rice to eat, and I got to thinking, he really conned me. He played all those things they told me about in survival school. He did it, and then I bought it hook, line. There ain't nobody else up here now. And I never heard any reference about another guy till I got to the zoo with those new 105 pilots. And one of the guys had been at the other base at Karate. And he said, I knew about you. You were shot down the same day as Ward Dodge. And he was a flight leader in another squad. I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah, he and another guy were shot down that day. They were 357th Squadron. So, yeah, they had the guy. They put him out, he's died in captivity about a week later. And once I got through the fear, and I mentioned the next day when I said he really hooked me, I got to shape up here and start earning my pay as a major in the United States Air Force. They came in the next morning and says, today you write your autobiography. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's Dakota Tunka. You won't write. He said, I ordered you to. I said, I don't take orders from you. None of these guys wore rank, so you didn't know who you were talking to really, but they all look like kids. As you know, Orientals tend to look much younger than they are for a long, long time. But we went through that, and they said, well, I bring in a camp commander. He orders you to write. I said, okay. So he goes, and I was really being this flippant and blasé, no kidding. So he comes back in a few minutes with a guy about his age, same size. He says, and this is the camp commander. And I said to myself, oh yeah, this was Saturday morning. I said, oh yeah, these guys were out drinking beer last night. They said, oh, we're going to have some fun with a new guy. He asked, will you write your autobiography? I said, nope. They talked in Vietnamese. He says, he asked you one last time. I said, no. He talked to me. He says, he orders you to write your autobiography. I said, I take my orders from the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He talked a little more in Vietnamese, and he says, one more time? I shook my head. And the camp commander looks up in very good English and says, you will be very sorry. Got up and walked out. 2 or 3 minutes later, this big guy comes in, biggest Vietnamese I saw. And they put me on the ground, pulled my arms back up behind me. I couldn't do it again. My life depended on it. My palms were together behind my neck. I could scratch my neck. And they put Vietnamese handcuffs right there. And they walked out. And I thought, this ain't a big deal. And about 5 minutes later, my hands were numb, my arms were numb, and shortly my shoulders were numb, and pretty soon my chest was numb. And so I started walking around so I could keep myself alert and active, I thought. Next thing I knew, I'm laying on the floor. I'd obviously fallen like that. And I did that 3 or 4 times till I just gave up, quit trying to walk around. And during the mealtime, that mealtime came, he comes in with a bowl of soup and a plate of rice and holds it up. And I said, oh, good. You're going to get a break here, get something to eat. He holds it up, sets it on the table, and he does that. And I shook my head. He walked over and picked it up and walked out. Maybe they are serious about this. Okay, I'll lay here a while longer. So I guess I passed out off and on, because the next time, the afternoon meal time came, he comes in with the soup and rice again, sets it down, did it. And I said, no. But I had been conscious enough during the time that I realized I hadn't seen another American. I've been here for 4 days now. And this was the funny part. I haven't felt my hands all day. This is into the afternoon. I haven't felt anything from my waist up in a good while. If I can't use my hands, I can't feed myself, and I probably can't play golf again. So when he starts to pick up the stuff to go away, I said, wait a minute. And he turned around, does that, and I said, I'll try. He picks it up. I said, okay. He turned around and nodded my head. He wouldn't leave till I said yes. So he left the suit, went out and got the officer, came back, and the officer asked me, and I tried with him, I'll try. And he shook his head. So I said, okay. So he takes the handcuffs off, and I'd been through rope tying up before, and when they do that, the whole purpose is to cut off circulation, and when they release it, it's like grabbing an electric wire. If you've ever been shocked, by a house current. Well, this time when he came off, I was just shook all over. And they brought in a little booklet, like I never had it down here, but they call it test booklets, the little blue book sort of thing, lined with a whole thing of questions. Sit down and write. And so for about 3 or 4 days, I'd sit there and hold a pen in my mouth and push it around with my hands. And I'd get 6 or 8 words on a page that way and use up stuff. And it was questions, what's your name? And I put it down. What's your father's name? I put daddy. What's your mother's name? I put mommy. Where were you born? I put early age. Just Mickey Mouse. See, I don't know. I guess I was so beaten down by this point I didn't really care what they did. I was going to have some fun in the process. But they never referred to that again. And it proved, for me at least, the whole point was, we can make you do it. What that sergeant had said. We'll show you that we run this camp. You'll do what we tell you to do. So from then on, it's a game of how much I could keep them from doing. And then that night, when you were asking, this was really my low point. When I ate that meal and realized that I had been broken. And so we had a big thunderstorm. It rained, and I was so thirsty. They hadn't given me any water except when the interrogator would be there, and he'd have a cup and offer it. And I remember I got up and I pulled the table over, put the chair on it, put the stool on it, and got up where I could get this vent, and reached out and got a hold of a limb on the tree so that the rain coming down and run down, and I'd get some water off my arm. And then it quit raining about the time I got it. And so I went over and leaned up against a wall, just slumped down, and there was one light way over in the corner. And I looked up, and it just kept attracting my attention. And I remember thinking it was like Moses in the burning bush, I guess. And I sat there and I looked at the light. And whether it was a split second or an hour, I can't tell you. But I had an experience of something happened to me, and it was all over. I feel very comfortable, very secure. You're going to live, you're going to get out of this, and you'll go home someday. And from then on, I was able to accept things that happened, and when there would be a crackdown right after escape in a night camp, and other things that come down, you'd have a little sense that this might be bad. I could just think about it for a minute, and I could feel comfortable again and go on and do what I had to do. And I remember thinking Harry Truman made the statement as president that he had no trouble sleeping every night because he knew he had done the best that day that he knew to do, and he needed his rest for the next day. And I realized that I was able to do that. I could lie down every night and go to sleep, no matter what was going on.
And how long had you been a prisoner when that happened?
I was shot down on Wednesday afternoon, and that was Saturday night.
So
3 days.
3 days after you were shot down, you feel you had a moment that gave you, I won't call it peace, but gave you something that got you through the rest of those years.
Yep.
Was there a day in that prison camp after that that you didn't feel that awareness or didn't think about that? Or did that sustain you every single day?
I can't say that I thought it consciously every day, but the feeling was there every day.
And what do you think about that now? What do you think that was?
It still sustains me, and the experience that I had there after we were in those large groups, we started, after some confrontations with the Vietnamese, we started having Sunday church services. And I thought about it a lot. You know, what does this mean to me? What do I do? And I participated, not as an activist, but participated in the services, attended. And when I got home, I went to see another one of our classmates down here at Georgia Tech who had become an Episcopal minister. And I talked to him about it and asked him, you know, how did you make the transition? Because he had been a technical major. How did you make the transition to the, and told me experience. And the first assignment I had when I got back was at the Air War College. And one of my classmates there was a Catholic priest that I got to know fairly well. And I was still in this time, you know, I was saved in that ejection. I went through this other experience. What am I here for? And the Catholic priest helped me put it in the best perspective. He said, don't try to solve the problem. He said, you go through your life looking for the sign or looking for this or what. And he said, you may miss what you're actually here for. He said, just accept the fact that you're here and make the most of it that you can. And that's really what's been with me ever since.
Not like 5.5, almost 6 years a prisoner. How did you find out you were going home and when you were going home? And tell me about that experience.
Well, to put it all in perspective, when Nixon started the bombing again in May of '72, we were in the big prison there at Wallow. And somebody that went to quiz, as we called the interrogations, because it was easier to say and to tap, brought back a message that Nixon is a crazy man. We don't know what happens now. But we had in our camp 1 South Vietnamese prisoner and 3 Thai prisoners who were allowed out to work and do things, and of course they were speaking the language, and they were really our intelligence. And we got a heads up that 209 was the number, literally, were going to be moved out of camp. And sure enough, about a week later, 209 of us were moved right up to the Chinese border, deep in the mountains, and a camp that we thought initially was new to us. We learned later on that others had been there ahead of us, who I don't know. But we spent the rest of '72 there and over the winter. And in October, we didn't have radios in each cell there. They didn't have power like we had back in the big prison. We had these little radios in each room, and you got these propaganda broadcasts. Hanoi, Hanoi, we called it, the Voice of Vietnam, all the garbage. Up here, they had to do it by quizzes. And one of the fellows that went early picked up, they were asking him, what do you think about this proposed end of the war, whatever. This is in early October. And then I was called out right at the end of October. And he asked me, he said, are you disappointed there was no settlement in October? I said, no, I didn't know there was going to be one. So how can I be disappointed for something I didn't know was going to happen? Wasn't going to happen anyway. And kind of went on with that. And then over Christmas and the holiday and New Year's, it got really cold and we were settling in. All of us were looking to be there in the winter. And one night, the building I was in up the top of the hill, one of the fellows woke us up and said, we just had 3 trucks come into camp. So we all stayed up and we counted 17 trucks. You don't need that many to bring in a month's load of food. Something is up. And the guards came around that morning and let us out to go out to eat or to shave, whatever we were going to do. We had a little area, kind of a little patio we could get out to in our building. And he looks around at one of the other guys and he does this. And then he goes back like that. Looks over, something is really up here. So we went back in, and just so we didn't miss out on it, we all started rolling up our gear. That afternoon when the guard came around and opened it up, and he gives us this, which was a signal to roll up, ready to move, we just all leaned over, patted our roll. He got a big smile on his face, and right after dark, they loaded us on the trucks, headed back to Hanoi, and about halfway down mid-afternoon, we stopped and had a little coffee break. They gave us water and little energy bars, coconut bar stuff. And instead of getting back on the truck necessarily to your own, they divided us out in 4 categories. And what turned out to be the first 2 release groups went back to the big prison. The 3rd release group went to the one we called a plantation, and the 4th one went to the zoo. And, excuse me, we'd been back about a week, and I was at the plantation in the 3rd group. They called us out one afternoon. We lined up, and the camp commander came over, and he read us the protocol from the Paris Treaty that in itself required that the prisoners be notified within 48 hours of this date. And they were told it, and they stood there for a few minutes waiting for us to do something, and when we didn't, they said, okay, dismissed, and we all filed back into our own little cells, and then we went over hugging each other. So, God, I hope it's true, hope it's true. And in my particular case, I was pulled out and taken up to Wallow. It turns out that after the first release group, there was a little difference of opinion between, and the conditions for release were that everybody would be released in 4 equal increments over the next 60 days. So, and with the sick and wounded being released first. Well, the U.S. expected that to be release the sick and wounded, then 4 more increments. The Vietnamese interpreted it to be the sick and wounded would be in the first increment. So they had a little hassle about that. And somehow they came up and released 20 guys, just pulled it almost at random, came out. So as that was going on, I was pulled up to the 2nd release group. Then they decided, no, the count didn't work, so I went back to the plantation. And then they pulled me out again. And whatever the problem was, we were supposed to be released on the 1st of March. And the camp commander came in, and we had the big, going away thing, special dinner, blah, 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 on the night of, last night in February. And then he told us, he said, maybe you do not go tomorrow. There is a small problem. I will let you know. So the next morning he comes in and said, I don't think so today. And that night he said, maybe tomorrow. And then by March the 3rd, we were said, oh, to hell with it. I hope somebody got out of here anyway. And he came in that night and he says, I think tomorrow, okay. And sure enough, the next morning he comes in and came in. There was a group called, I forget the exact name, but they were an Indian, a Canadian, a Czech, and another Soviet Union type had to come around and inspect everybody. So they came through. We figured, I think we might make it today. And sure enough, about an hour later, we started going out. We got our go-home clothes that we'd been fitted for. We went out to pick them up, put them on. And they walked us out the front gate, and they had their little 20-seat buses out there, and we all got on and headed over to Gilum for the big trip home.
I'd like to hear this.
Well, we got out there as we pulled out onto the ramp, and I saw that 141 out there. Of course, working out there, my neighbor at Craig had gotten out of the Air Force and was test pilot in 141, and I'd walked out into one just before I left to go to Southeast Asia. And I saw that airplane, the United States of America, and that big flag up there. And I told a lot of people, when I walked down and walked up that ramp, I could smell the red clay out of North Georgia. I knew I was going home.
Is that just an expression, or did you really feel like you smelled? I mean,
I started feeling like I'm headed home, yeah.
Well, the one question I want to ask you, the penultimate, next to the last, is a lot of things changed for you while you were a prisoner. You found out about losing your father and losing other family members and your wife. And again, if you don't mind my asking, what sustained you through that?
Well, I had premonitions, or indications, I guess you'd say, on both. I only got 2 letters from my wife, and there were 6 lines, but she only used about 4 of them. So all she just said was, the children are fine, they help a lot. Another one was, I moved to Atlanta to go to Emory, the children doing well. You could almost read into it the indifference. And in the case of my dad, the one thing that I got from my mother was a birthday card that was signed Love, Mother. And that was probably one of the really low points when I realized he was gone, because I was looking forward to seeing him. I knew he was in bad shape when I left, but I was looking forward to going back and seeing him again. And so when I got there to Clark, we'd been there, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, and he came around and got me and said, there's a colonel up here who wants to see you. And he introduced himself from 13th Air Force headquarters. And we were standing in the doorway to the little ward area that I was in, and I looked up, and a technician that had been seeing me around was leaned up to the desk up here about 20, 30 feet. And I don't know why I turned around. There was another technician back standing around over here. This is not going to be a standard conversation. What is it? So he started out casually. He told me about my aunt dying and my uncle dying and my father-in-law dying. And then your father died, and then your wife got a divorce. And as I've described it, it wasn't a surprise. It was the shock of confirmation. The things that I was hoping weren't true, but I had a sense. And it was kind of ironic when I learned about more detail about my wife's divorce. When I was up in the mountains and I hadn't gotten anything, heard anything, I went to a quiz and I asked an officer whom I'd known from way back at the zoo. I said, I hadn't heard anything from my wife in a long time. I said, I'm wondering if maybe something has happened. I said, no, I think everything's fine. And I said, well, I would really like to know. I don't want my children to be hurting or have any problem. He said, okay, I ask. And several months later, I went to quiz with him again, and he said, I asked. He said, I think everything okay. As it turns out, that first quiz was within a week of when she filed for the divorce, and the second one was within a week of when it was granted. And they had sent the paperwork to Hanoi to camp a detention. And since I didn't reply within 30 days, I wasn't contesting it. Well, I was still going through the checkout down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, but my mother wanted to get the family together at home and visit. And so I flew up commercially, and my ex-wife was here in town at the time. She came out and picked me up at the airport, and we went over to her house, and we were talking. I was going to take my children out with me for this party, and we were sitting there talking, and she said, "How you plan on getting to Bremen?" I said, "Oh, gosh." Thought it hadn't crossed my mind. Oh, well, I'll rent a car. Oh, no, I guess I can't do that. I don't have a driver's license. Why? I didn't think of riding the bus. I don't know, because that'd been right off the bat. I thought, well, maybe Pat will rent me an airplane, because I had a pilot's license, commercial license, and I wasn't thinking of the fact that you got to have a medical to make it effective. But she said, well, you better do something. So this is getting kind of late if you're going out there tomorrow. So I called him up. I don't know, I guess we were looking at the phone book. I got him at home. And I said, hey, you got any airplane you might rent out tomorrow? He says, what for? I said, well, I need to get out to Bremen with me and the children. He said, when you want to go? And I said, oh, sometime mid-morning or so. And he says, hold on a minute. He looked around and he said, how's about 10 o'clock? Would that be good? 10:30? I said, yeah, it'd be fine. So he said, well, you know how to get out to my place? And I said, yeah. He said, all right, I'll see you then. So we come driving up out here, and it turns out he had a demonstration set up for a hope for sale with a King Air, I think it was. Anyways, about an 8 or 10 place airplane. And this company, people were here, and they were really nice, welcoming us in. And said, yeah, we'll be glad. And they gave me a ride out to West Georgia Airport, and my brother was there to pick me up. But Pat and I have laughed about that a lot of times.
Those 6 years of your life that you literally gave to this country, and all that happened to you, what would you say to young people? Or what would you, if you could get them all to pay attention to you for the next minute, what would you say?
Well, first I would say that I'm proud of my service. At the time I was there, I honestly believed that we were doing something that needed to be done, because the threat of communism and the expansion of China and their efforts to, particularly in Asia and in Southeast Asia, could have had very difficult future. And while we did not win, and unfortunately I think I have to say we actually did win the combat. Our politicians gave it away later on. But we did accomplish a stalemate, so to speak, and I think we stopped that expansion, gave those countries a chance to get on a little firmer basis. As far as Vietnamese people, I was disappointed for them, the boat people, that many were killed or died in the process of getting out of there, and in Cambodia that were literally killed during the Pol Pot regime. I don't think we can take any pride at all in allowing that to happen. But when we finally started recognizing the Vietnamese, I was asked by one of the local stations, what do you think about it with the trade and then the recognition? And I said, well, we're going over there to give them a chance for self-determination, and it looks like they're finally going to get it. And on the 2 trips I've made back over there, I think we really did win the hearts and minds, because they really like Americans there now. But for the status now and the condition and the future of this country, I have real concern. The last few years, the mood of the country, the culture of the country, society have changed in ways that I cannot say that I feel proud about. But I do talk to enough young people who have good attitudes and good patriotic values that I'm optimistic that they will rise to the top and be the cream of the crop, and we'll get this country back on track someday.